friends, and welcome to Bad Book Club, where I, Jade, a silly goose with an English degree, read classic and popular literature so you don't have to. Hello, party people. Have you all had a party today of some kind? I hope that you did, just a small party for you. But welcome to the podcast. This episode will be about Life of Pi by Yann Martel. I can jump into a little bit about Yann Martel. Honestly, I don't have much to tell you. He's just an author. He's a cool dude named Yann Martel. He was born in 1963. He's a Canadian author, and he won a Man Booker Prize for The Life of Pi. So that's pretty cool beans. He starts off this whole book with a little note from the author about how before he wrote this book, he had written another that had just flopped. So he traveled and tried to find a new way to write. And it's a nice little author's note to begin with. And it kind of vibes with the whole story of the story. So there you go. But for the most part, I just want to talk about the book today and just really jump into it. So why don't we just get started? I'm really excited to get started and to talk about it and to do it. Let's go. Let's do it. Let's do it. Are you ready? Let's go. Let's go. Actually, I know I just said that we'd be starting right off, but I forgot to talk to you about Life of Pi in general and the fact that you've probably heard about it. Life of Pi is that one about a boy in a boat with a tiger. It was also a movie, so I'm sure that you've heard about it at some point. My dad calls it Tiger in a Boat. That's what he calls this book and the movie. So I'm sure you've heard of it, but I just thought I'd start with that because the intro to the book actually takes place after the story. So it says that his suffering made him sad, and the suffering being the rest of the story that he's going to tell you. But after he got over his suffering, he went to religious studies and zoology, and that brought him out of his stupor after this episode. And he studied two-toed sloths, which is very cute. They're slow moving. He talks about majoring in his studies and Canada, where he's living. He talks about his recovery of not being able to walk after this episode that we all know what it is, but we don't know yet because we're reading the book. Oh, and then there's this one episode about how a waiter once asked him, fresh off the boat, are you? Because he was eating Indian food with his hands, and then he paled because that phrase was really hard for him to hear, which makes a lot of sense because he's about to get stuck on a boat with a tiger. I will tell you that this book is broken into 3 parts. Part 1 is not at all tiger related. It is a little bit, but it's not tiger in a boat. The beginning third of this book, maybe more, is really about his past and his history and how he found religion. Religion is extremely important. I would say that religion is actually this book. I think this is a book about religion and not much else, and faith. So the whole first part actually is really slow moving. It's all about how he finds different religions and how he actually practices 3 simultaneously, which is pretty wild, but I'll get there. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll also talk about the structure of the book. So the structure of the book is from the present, looking at this past episode of the tiger. It is Pi is telling us the story. But we also get these little excerpts, not in part 2, but in part 1 and part 3, where he some sort of writer is working with Pi, and it's his written down experiences with Pi. So we get Pi also from an outside angle because the writer is looking at him. So honestly, I don't know what to think about that. I don't know if the writer is the one who supposedly wrote this book and these are his thoughts that he put in himself partway through. I don't know. Or if this is Pi literally telling him the story, and then while he's telling the story, we're also getting the impressions of the writer. I'm not sure. I think it's up to you, whatever you think. I like to think of this as coming from the mouth of Pi himself, just because I like that. And because, so we get little images of Pi, and I always call it the writer section. So after chapter 1, there's a writer section where the writer talks to us about what Pi looks like. He's small and slim. He's 5'5", dark hair, dark eyes. He's around 40 at this time. So the writer's obviously talking to him, 20 years after this event, or more. And then we switch back to Pi's life. So Pi talks about how he was named after a swimming pool because one of his father's earliest friends was this guy named Francis, and they called him Mamaji because that's the word for uncle. And that everyone else was terrible swimmers, but this guy in his family, his brother Ravi, his parents were both terrible swimmers, but his uncle, Mamaji, was a great swimmer and constantly talked about the pools that he would love to go to in Paris and stuff like that. And when Pi was born, they named him after one of those swimming pools. They named him after Piscine Molitor Patel in Paris, which is like a really nice pool, like a really nice one. Pi is the only one who really took to swimming. So the rest of his family really hated it, but he loved to swim. No one else in his family could swim but him. And he would swim in the ocean and swim in the pools with Mamaji, and that was like his thing. But his name was Piscine, which is not Pi, but his name is Piscine. Pi then tells us that he grew up in a zoo. So like not in a zoo, he was not an animal, but his dad owned the zoo, and therefore he grew up being around the zoo constantly and around the animals. He talks about how zoos are not bad. So he defends zoos and says that animals get to be fed here and they have their own territory and that they like it. And there are several cases of like escaped animals that choose to come back to the zoo because they like it there. Like he says, it's like man, how we don't want to walk around outside. We made houses. So he says it's like that. He defends zoos, which tracks for someone whose father owned a zoo, I think. I think he would defend zoos if you were that close to it. I don't really have a stake personally in the zoo argument. I think that there are probably, you could make an argument for both sides of it being bad for animals and also it being good for animals. This is really personal. I don't really care. It's fine. I like going to zoos because I like seeing animals, but I will say there are some sad zoos that I've been to. I really don't like sad zoos where the enclosures are tiny and the animals don't have any trees or toys, and it's really sad. And so I think if it's a good zoo, then it's a good zoo. So that's where I land. Anyway, let's keep going. And then he ends this little bit by telling us that the reason why his name first changed was because in school, the kids were really mean. Instead of calling him Piscine, which is his name, they called him Pissing. And even teachers would sometimes like slip up and say that just because they'd be tired and not realize that they said it. But constantly he was called Pissing throughout like the first part of his life. And he hated it, which no wonder I would hate that too. I'm just going to tell you right now, the first half of this part 1 is really philosophical. I really think that, like I said, the key to this story is faith and religion, and just belief also, like just the ability to believe in something that seems unbelievable. But the first half of the book really tries to put you in the world, I think, because in order for us as a reader to believe that a boy is stuck on a lifeboat with a tiger and lives and the tiger lives, we have to really be in his world. So what the whole part 1 does is tell us what Pi knows about animals, why he's good at that kind of thing, and like why he's able to like do this. So it's supposed to put us in a frame of like belief that this could be a possible event that occurs. Because I think if you had opened it with part 2, I would not believe that it was happening. I'd be like, okay, like this is ridiculous, utterly ridiculous. But by starting it with all this background information about Pi's life, his beliefs, and all these things about why, like, I don't know, just about his life, it just makes more sense to us later that when we come across the scene with the boat and the tiger, that he knows somewhat how animals work and what they do, because he grew up in a zoo and he grew up thinking about how animals and humans are related and about what the relationship is. So it's not surprising, but only because you read 70 pages worth of background info first. I would say that this book, honestly, doesn't get really going until like maybe page 100. It's not interesting. It's just that the back cover says that he's stuck on a boat with a tiger, and you don't get there till page 100. So I don't know. It's one of those things where like it feels really slow to me at first. But anyway, back to the story. Pi says that although that was his life when he was younger, when they moved schools with all of his grade and went to a new school, that he decided to change his name. He knew what he was going to do. And when the teacher got to him and said, and what's your name? He stood up and he grabbed a piece of chalk and wrote 3.14 and then drew a big circle and drew a line through it and then said Pi. That's his name, Pi. And he did that for every single class that day. And he says that repetition is important not only for animals, but also for people. And that later throughout the day, all the teachers accepted it, but eventually even his students started to accept that, because at the end of the day, they'd all shout with him as he wrote down the numbers on the board, which is actually really cute. They'd be like 3.14, which is adorable. And he says that he also started kind of a trend. Lots of people started like having mathematic nicknames. There was like an omega and stuff at school. Anyway, he mentions that he had a teacher named Mr. Kumar, and that Mr. Kumar was one of his favorite teachers. And one day he came to the zoo, and that was when he met his first like atheist, because he walked toward him at the zoo and said, "Hello, Mr. Kumar." And Mr. Kumar was talking about the animals and basically mentioned that like, oh, like God doesn't exist. Don't know how we got there, but we did. And he was like, no, only science exists. Like, I had polio and science was what saved me, not God. And this is like a big deal to Pi, because he's like, whoa, people don't believe in God, because he's a very just like faithful man. I don't know the word. Religious man, but there's like a better word that I'm thinking of. But anyway, you know what I mean. He is so at his person, a person of belief, that he doesn't like understand how someone could not believe in God, but he accepts it, still thinks Mr. Kumar is like his favorite person. And he talks about like reason and doubt and what it does to like humans. Like I said, it's very philosophical, this whole front bit. He talks about how man, though, is the most dangerous creature at the zoo. He tells us all these really sad stories about how zoos in the past have had people like poison the animals and like feed them things that purposefully hurt them and stuff. And I was like, what? That's so mean. He mentions like, you know, a monkey will reach its arms through the bars for a snack and a human will like break its arm, which is just like so sad. But he just talks about how man is really the most dangerous person. However, there is one creature that is more dangerous than man. Can we guess? What do you think it is? Can you hear my cat? She just meowed at me. What? Kitty? My husband, by the way, has to close. We have a studio at our home now, and there are several doors that lead to this little hallway in front of the music studio, and we have to close all those doors because she will just sit at my door and meow at me the whole time, and I would let her in because I'm sure you're like, why not just let her in? But she would also just meow at me the whole time, and she would just be way louder. So anyway, that little kitty out there is world's most dangerous predator. She sat at my feet so much while I was reading this story that I was like laughing because I was like, you're a dangerous tiger. Anyway, she makes me laugh. But he mentions that once when he was younger, his dad got it into his head that the kids needed to be told that these animals are dangerous. And Pi knew that. He was fully aware. However, apparently his dad had some sort of worry that the kids might think the tiger's nice and stick their hands in. So in order to teach them a lesson, he starved one of the tigers for 3 days and then made them watch while it ate a goat. They just put a goat in the cage with it and made them watch while the tiger like just full on ate a goat. And he walked through the whole zoo and talked about how dangerous all the animals are except for guinea pigs because they are not dangerous. And it's a really rough moment. But like I said, this is supposed to set us up for later whenever we realize that tigers are extremely dangerous. But Pi has certain knowledge that other people do not have that leads to it being somewhat believable that he might survive with a tiger on a boat. Next, Pi talks to us a bit about animal behavior. So it's all about animal behavior. He talks about flight distance, which is the distance at which an animal can have a human nearby without running. That's like a thing that a zoo has to figure out. Like, how close can you stand without the creature feeling like it has to hide from you? That's called the flight distance. He talks about territory and how circus works, because a creature will become a beta in whatever situation they're in if you show yourself as the alpha and if you put them in your territory, because animals are all about territory. So that's why the lions jump through hoops, is because the guy stamps his feet and they're in his territory and they are like, whoa, this dude's freaking out. We better do what he says and stuff like that. So he just gives us a bunch of information about animals. Again, this is just to try to give us enough information about animals that we start to see the tiger not as a tiger, but as a being that can be tamed. Because I don't think that if you or I was standing at a zoo or even sitting in our home thinking of a tiger, that we would consider that it's possible to tame a tiger. But this whole story is supposed to lead us to the conclusion that it is possible to tame a tiger, because they tame lions and tigers are crazy, and he's on a boat, but it's possible. So that's what we're supposed to be believing at the moment. We also get point of view of the writer again. He tells us that when telling his story, Pi gets really uncomfortable sometimes and like anxious, which makes sense, I think. And then we also get a description of Pi's house. Pi has a house full of shrines to more than one religion. So he has the cross, but he also has Hindu drawings and Islam depictions and things like that all through his house. He's a devout man. That's the word I was looking for earlier, devout. He's a very devout man, and he follows more than one religion, and it's somewhat surprising to our writer that we are following along with. That opens the segue into how and why Pi became a devout practitioner of all Christianity, Islam, and Hindu. He says that he's been Hindu since he was a baby, when his aunt took him to the temple and introduced him to it, and he loved like the feeling of Hindu. And then he mentions the day that he met Jesus Christ, which was on vacation with his family to Manar, and there were 3 hills, and on the hills were a mosque, a Hindu temple, and a Christian church. And he said that he went to the Christian church, and it looked like a fortress, and that the priest was there peacefully eating, and there were paintings of this victim, and he wasn't sure who it was. Obviously, we all know it's Jesus. And then the next day, he went to talk again, and Martin the priest said that Jesus was dying for our sins, and Pi thought that was like the weirdest thing. He talks about how annoying it is, and that Jesus is not like a god, and like, because gods are invincible, and like death is so permanent, and like he talks about how annoyed he is with this religion for like 2 pages. And then he says that he couldn't stop thinking about it, and that he wanted to be a part of the religion because he was so intrigued by this human like God that the Christians, believe in. So it's this nice little chapter where he's like very annoyed but finds like some sort of peace in that annoyance. It's very cute. Next we learn how he became a part of Islam. He said that was a year later. He said that there was a mosque in Mullah Street, and that he saw this little bread shop, and he picked up his bread because it was like weird bread, and there was a man praying in there, and like it would surprise him because he didn't expect to see that man. He said, "What is your religion about?" And the man was like, "I'll be happy to tell you." And he said it's about beloved, and it's about brotherhood and devotion, and his name is Satish Kumar. And Pi mentions that the 2 Kumars in his life who led him to be a major in zoology and religion were Mr. Kumar of Islam and Mr. Kumar of his school. So basically, that's how he found the other religions. He found they all were like really beautiful, and he really liked that they were all about different gods, and in his mind, they could all coexist because he just wants to love God. But we're going to get to that bit in a second. God has always been really close to his life. Like, everything about Kumar's bread shop was heavy with glory, which I really liked that word. It was a nice phrase. And that he once saw a vision of the Virgin Mary in snow in Canada, and that God is just really important to him. And we switch to the writer that we've been hearing about this whole time. And he mentions that in a cafe that Pi has made him sort of question his stance on his dry, yeastless life, which is a very interesting thing to say. And then he switches, and Pi talks to us about love and moral understanding. He talks about agnostics and how he finds them to be the most annoying because they just live a life of doubt. He thinks that if you're an atheist, you've at least chosen to believe in something other than God, or to believe that there is no God. But he said an agnostic has a dry, yeastless, the same phrase, life that doesn't really fit in with anything. He said all you do is doubt your entire life, and that it's not a very good story. Now, Jan Martel himself said that this 2 chapters between the writer and Pi's writing on agnostics is the core of the novel. So I feel like I know what he's talking about, and it'll make more sense later, and so I might wait to talk about it. But right now, basically, he's talking about the difference between believing in something and believing in nothing, and how believing in nothing leads to just a boring life. He says believing in something might be wrong, but it gives you more interest. Stuff like that. Basically, it's the better story is what he says. One day, all of his family members find out that he's been going to 3 different types of religions, to mosques and churches and the temple. And they're like, what are you doing? Because apparently his parents are not even that religious. So they don't really understand his connection to God or why he has it. But it's cute. His parents seem supportive. And they talk about, why? We don't understand. And he's like, well, just cause. And they decide to have a meeting with all 3 of the leaders of the church to talk about what Pi is going to do. And they all meet, and these 3 holy men gather together, And they're all really upset. They're like, well, like, why are you following these other two? Like, my religion's the best. Like, well, and they like are all arguing. And Pi says to them, Bapu Gandhi says that all religions are true. I just want to love God. And the holy men are kind of like, okay, like, I guess that's all we're trying to do. And they all kind of leave and are okay with Pi practicing these three religions. And Pi then asks his parents for a prayer rug and to be baptized. And they are very confused, but eventually they give in and let him do this because it's what he wants. Next, we get more information on animals and how they adapt and accept information without question if it benefits them. Like, if they just quickly adapt. So if they find themselves in a lifeboat, for example, just a crazy one that I have off the top of my head, they're going to adapt to whatever works for them, as long as it benefits them. So that's an important thing. I have a little note here that says background information is painstaking because the number of times that, for me as a reader who maybe doesn't need anything given to me on the surface, I feel like I got beat over the head a little bit with the information about animals. But to be fair to other people, I imagine they don't have like minors in psychology and already know how conditioning works and things like that. But in general, I found that the information at the beginning just took a long time to get where it was going. And to be fair, I don't think it was that boring or sad or long or anything like that. It's just that I knew this was Tiger in a Boat, and I was waiting for Tiger in a Boat, and this whole time he's just talking about philosophy and religion and who to love and how to love, and I was like, oh my God, I just get to the boat bit. But the whole point of the book is not the boat bit. So by the end, I had gotten there. It's just that I had a hard time getting into the book when I first started reading it. You just have to be patient. This is like a story in patience. You just gotta be chill. But basically, we learn that his father is nervous because India is going through lots of change. This is set in the 70s, by the way. I don't know if I've mentioned that before. And so they decide to move. They're going to move to Winnipeg, Canada, which is crazy. I actually have Canadian family. So if they're listening, what's up, Canadian family? Anyway, they decide to move to Canada. We also get the writer's point of view, by the way. He talks about photos of Pi. They mentioned that going through all the photos in his scrapbook, all the ones from back then, there's not any because they like barely survived. So all of them are from the zoo, and there's like a couple, and he has one that has this being called Richard Parker in the background. We get references to Richard Parker maybe twice. I'd say that this book is really intense on foreshadowing. So almost the entire first half just foreshadows what happens next. We hear references to his foster mom. By the way, if you hear a reference to someone's foster mom, what that means is that their parents are dead. So I knew his family died after like a couple chapters. You know that some sort of being named Richard Parker is going to be on the boat. We hear about tigers. It's very heavy on the foreshadowing. But like I said, I think that it's not a mistake. I think it's necessary because without that, even I don't think I would have believed about the boat and the lifeboat thing. You have to give us context. Otherwise, we're not going to be in the story. So it works. It is painstakingly slow, I think, at first for my own personal choice. But anyway, he talks about how his dad sells all the zoo animals to Americans and to Canadians and whoever wants to take them, and how they will load a boat and sail to Winnipeg and on June 21st, 1977. Next, we switch to the writer's perspective, and he goes to Pi's place and he meets Pi's wife, which he didn't realize Pi had a wife. And then he meets his daughter, and then Pi talks about his son, and he talks about his cat. And he has this nice life living in Canada. And it's just this little chapter about how the writer meets them. And then this part one ends with a sentence that says, "This story has a happy ending." And that's the end of part one. They are now on the boat and they're sailing. And by the way, this book has a lot of funny moments. I know that it seems really serious when I'm telling it to you, but there are lots of funny moments because Pi has a really strong voice. So sometimes he's like, oh, like the zoo paperwork for moving animals, or, you know, just in general, he's a funny guy. So there's even some discussion in the back of this book for like book clubs. And it talks about, do you think this book is a tragedy, a comedy? Like, what do you think it is? Personally, I found it to be really tragic, but I don't think it is a tragedy, but it is like a tragic story. So anyway, it has a happy ending though. So when I'm talking to you, just be okay. But the next bit starts with the ship sank. Do you ever have a day where you're just feeling kind of tired? I'm just feeling a little tired today, but not like bad tired, just like, like happy, peaceful tired. So I'm just, making my way easily through this story. But anyway, we're now to the bit that I bet you've been waiting for and I was waiting for, the tiger in a boat. Of course, we start off with a description of the ship sinking. The very first sentence, the ship sank, which I think is so sad but a little funny because I was like, what? It is so funny. But he talks about how it was a really big sound. And when he was in the water, he saw something. He was in the lifeboat. He saw something in the water. He cried, "Richard Parker, is that you? Oh, it's so hard to see. If only the rain would stop. Richard Parker, it's you." He says, "Don't give up. Come to the lifeboat. Do you hear this whistle?" And he whistles and he says, "You heard it. Swim, swim. Come on." And he mentions that he had seen me. He looked panic stricken. He started swimming my way. The water about him was shifting wildly. He looked small and helpless. And he says, "Richard Parker, can you believe what happened to us? Tell me it's a bad dream." And he's just lapsing into tragic poetic prose. It's very very dramatically Shakespeare, but maybe he talks like that. I don't know. And he's whistling for Richard Parker, and eventually he gets closer and he realizes what's happening because he's like, "Oh my God, this is a tiger. Hold on. I don't want you in the boat with me." And he yanks on the rope because he had thrown Richard Parker a life buoy, and he yanks it back, but Richard Parker grabs onto it and he grabs an oar and tries to push him off. And he said, "Get lost, drown, go somewhere else." And I'm so sad for Richard Parker. And I think that this scene, the purpose of it is to make us pity Richard Parker, because in order for us as a reader to be able to believe this story, we have to believe a couple things. We have to believe that, one, Pi knows what he's doing. That's what part one was for. Two, we have to know that this tiger is not a monster. So we have to see human and sad, and we have to pity this tiger. We have to feel empathy for this tiger. We have to not want it to die, because if we want it to die, then the whole point of the story is just dumb, right? So we don't want the tiger to die, so he gives him lots of feelings. And at this point, Pi's pushing him off the boat, and we're like, no. So he leads us where he wants us to go. He wants us to want the tiger to be in the boat with Pi, and therefore it's more believable because we want the tiger there. We don't want this tiger to drown. That's how I was feeling. So I was literally like, no, let the tiger in the boat. And the tiger jumps in the boat because he's so fast. Pi steps over the zebra and throws himself overboard, which is, I did not expect him to do that. And then we rewind back in time. He starts us with just being on the boat. He says the boat was normal, the animals were there, everything was normal, the crew was fine, mostly ignored them. He was tracking their course because he thought it was fun, and I think they were 4 days on the way, I believe. They were not that far. And that one night he just heard a sound that woke him up, and he immediately forgot about the sound, but decided that he was up, so he was going to go and walk around and see what was going on. He tried to wake up his brother, Ravi, but Ravi was like, let me sleep. And he was like, fine. Walks past his parents' bedroom and was like, I won't bother them. Father likes to sleep. Goes up 2 flights of stairs to the deck, and it's raining, and he's like, yay, Canada! And he's ready for adventure, and was foreshadowing and in general, oh no, Pi. And anyway, he's like, yeah, I'm so excited. And then he realizes that the boat is tilting, haphazardly so. Something is definitely wrong. The boat is tilting. And he's like, whoa. And then he sees an animal, running across the deck. And he's like, oh, an animal is out? Who let the animal out? And he goes to check on his parents. He goes down a flight, and then it's full of water. So I don't know if you remember last time he went up the deck, but when he went up the deck, it was 2 flights. He goes down 1 flight. It's full of water. So the chambers where he was and where his parents were are flooded. He doesn't ever know what happened to his parents. What I'm assuming is that maybe they got out, maybe they didn't, but they can't swim. Just a reminder from the beginning that we learned. He's the only one in his family who can swim. And he goes back up to the deck. He's like, oh no, what's going on? And he sees some crewmen. So he runs up to them and says, what are you doing? Please, what's going on with the boat? And they are Japanese crewmen. So they're I don't know what you're talking about. We don't speak English. They thrust a life jacket in his hands and they pick him up. And he's like, where are you taking me? And he trusts them, and they toss him overboard. And luckily he lands with a bounce on a tarp on top of a lifeboat. So he calls it a tarpaulin. I actually had to Google it because I was like, what the heck is a tarpaulin? A tarpaulin is just a tarp. I have just never heard it called that before. And he lands on this tarp that's like stretched out over this lifeboat. And he bounces and he's like, whoa, what's going on? And then before he thinks the crewman can get in, a zebra like sails over them and lands in the boat. And it like, I'm assuming it's hanging. Here's the thing. When it comes to boats and descriptions of boats and things on boats, I don't know if it's either that Jan Martel just maybe could have set the scene for me a little bit more, or if it's my own lack of knowledge of like seafaring. Maybe if you guys are really good, at the sea, if you read this book, you'll know exactly what he's talking about. Or maybe just like me, you'll be a teeny bit confused because it's supposed to be a confusing scene anyway. So maybe he just didn't worry about it. But I believe the lifeboat is hanging, like from like little arms, like next to the boat so they can load it. And the zebra jumps into it and it breaks and it falls down onto the water. And that's when he's floating and watching the ship sink. And that's when he sees Richard Parker and calls Richard Parker onto the boat. Now, if you remember in the last scene, he jumped off the boat. So he gets Richard Parker onto the boat and then goes, oh no, there's a tiger here, and jumps off the boat. And he uses an oar as a buoy because it's a storm and the oars are floating. They're supposed to float. So he's using an oar as a buoy and sees shark fins. So there are sharks in the water and he's like, oh my God. So he like kind of swims up to the boat and sticks an oar. Now here's the thing. Again, this is a situation where I'm not quite sure, but this is what I pictured in my head. It's this boat, right? A lifeboat, classic lifeboat size, pretty big, I think, enough to fit like 30 people. And there's a tarp over half of it, like tight. And the tarp is tied down like around the boat. So at the very end, I guess it's a little bit, like loose. So he stabs an oar in there, not like into the boat, but under the chain connecting it or something, so that the oar is sticking out, kind of like, is it called the prow of a ship when it's like a little pointy thing? Kind of like that. And he hangs onto the oar for dear life because he's out of the water technically and he's not in the lifeboat with the tiger. He hangs there all night sobbing because his life is destroyed and ruined and he's in a storm and the ocean's hitting him because he's hanging onto an oar. I don't even know. But basically, after all this, he realizes he lost the life jacket, but he has a whistle, which is good. And after the rain kind of leaves, now he woke up at 4:30 in the morning. So it wasn't that long of a night to be crying for. It just until the sun came up. And he realizes that he can't see the tiger. Now, this is one of my other complaints with the back cover, is that the back cover tells us that the tiger is going to eat the creatures on this boat. It literally says on the back cover, it says, when Pi 16, his family and their zoo immigrate from India to North America, alas, the ship sinks, and Pi finds himself in a lifeboat, his only companion a hyena, an orangutan, a wounded zebra, and a tiger. Soon the tiger has dispatched all but Pi. Can Pi and the tiger find their way to land? So I know this like completely ruined the next bit, so I'm just going to tell you what happens then, because it literally tells you on the back cover. But basically, he looks around and sees absolutely nothing. There are no people. There are no other lifeboats. It's just him out here. And he doesn't see the tiger, but he does see a hyena and a zebra with like a broken leg. He realizes what probably happened is that the Japanese sailors couldn't get in the lifeboat because there was a hyena in there. So they threw him in there to try and get the hyena distracted so that they could get in the lifeboat. But then the zebra sailed over them and took the lifeboat. So the crew members were not being nice when they tossed Pi into a lifeboat with a hyena. And he understands that if there's a hyena here, then the tiger must have either died or gotten off, because there's no way that these two creatures could coexist. And the zebra is obviously injured. The orangutan isn't there initially. What happens is the orangutan, named Orange Juice, which is really cute, he sees her floating on some bananas. So she floats up on some bananas and comes onto the boat, and she's this little old Orange Juice orangutan he grew up with, and she's very sweet. And he takes the net off the bananas, but doesn't take the bananas, which even I thought was stupid. And he says literally he regretted later because he should have taken the bananas. But he takes that net, and he said that net was extremely helpful. The next bit I'm just going to tell to you quickly. It takes a couple chapters, but from the back cover, we already know all these animals die. What happens is Pi thinks the tiger is gone. Since the back cover has told us the tiger's not gone for basically 5 chapters, I was literally like, oh my gosh, when's the tiger going to appear? The hyena eats the zebra's leg, the broken leg, and he kills the zebra, and the zebra dies a very sad, slow, painful death. And the orangutan and the hyena have this whole thing for a while where like they aren't sure what to do with each other. And then eventually the orangutan and the hyena come to like a little bit of blows, and the orangutan hits the hyena really hard on the head, and they separate for a little bit. And then after a while, it happens again. They have a fight, and the orangutan loses and like gets killed, and I think beheaded even, like really violently. And then after a while, the hyena's still there, and the tiger appears. Pi, during this fight, kind of ran away and is standing on a bench and looks down and sees Richard Parker right below him staring up at him. So the tiger has been under the tarp, under the benches for a while and just hasn't come out. And by the way, throughout this whole episode, Pi is just in the midst of despair because his family is gone and dead, and he like cries constantly, and it's very sad. And even Orange Juice, the orangutan, is really sad because her 2 sons aren't with them. So he thinks that she's also like sad for them. So it's a bummer. Anyway, after seeing Richard Parker, Pi basically collapses in like a faint because there's just too much happening, I guess, for him. And he talks about how Richard Parker got his name. Apparently, it was a hunter. He was trying to get rid of, I think, some sort of panther in the area, but came across some tigers and tranquilized the mother and her cub. Didn't kill them, but did ship them to the zoo. And he named the cub, I think, what did he name the cub? Thirsty. He named the cub Thirsty, which is hilarious. But the paperwork got mixed up. So instead of being called Thirsty, it was listed that the hunter's name was Thirsty and that the tiger's name was Richard Parker. So it stuck, and that's why the tiger has the name Richard Parker. I think that naming him Thirsty obviously has to do with the fact he's on a boat, right? And it's kind of like a little like comment on it. But also, I think it's important that his name is Richard Parker, because by calling a tiger by a human name, it humanizes the tiger for the reader. Because if his name was Thirsty, I don't know, even Orange Juice, so it's just one of those things where like those are animal names. Richard Parker is a human name, and it gives him human qualities that makes the reader more invested in Richard Parker's story and makes Richard Parker seem more real and believable that the story could happen. So I think it's important that he had a human name, and I think it's really funny that he chose Richard Parker. It's just a funny name. When Pi wakes up, he realizes that there's no hope for him at all. There's a tiger on here. And in the midst of that, he felt better. It's this funny scene where he talks about often whenever you give up, you just feel better because you're like, oh, not so bad. It's just a funny scene. But he says that what happened probably is that often when it comes to dangerous animals, they'll sedate them for trips. So probably he's still working off some sedation and also some seasickness, which makes a lot of sense why he hasn't attacked anything. Using this time, now that the animals are all dead on board, he tries to look around for supplies. It's been a couple days now. He's thirsty. He's hungry. He knows that it's a lifeboat and it should have supplies. So he lifts one end of the tarp. Reminder that this tarp covers about like half to 3/4 of the boat, and Richard Parker's underneath it. Well, on the prow end, again, this is one of those situations where I'm not sure exactly, but on the prow end of the ship where Pi's oar is hanging, he kind of loosens it to look under, and he finds a locker. And I think that if he lifts the locker, it like blocks the way for Richard Parker or something underneath the tarp. I don't know, but somehow lifting the locker blocks Richard Parker from seeing him, and he's able to find supplies, which is great. He drinks 4 cans of water, and he eats a bunch of food, and he makes a list of what he has because there's also journals and pens. And at this point, honestly, in the book, what I wrote down in the margins here is I want more Richard Parker because, like I said, this is page 153 now, and the whole back cover is about the tiger. And so it's 153 and the tiger's made 1 appearance so far. And of course we get much more Richard Parker after this, but that's when it really got interesting for me because come on, you guys. I was like, let's go. Let's just do this already. But anyway, like I was saying, he makes a list of everything he has. Just a lot of food, a lot of water, some useful things like life jackets. There's these solar stills for making water. There's rain catchers, just a lot of useful things and a survival thing. And he decides that Richard Parker's on board, so he has to make a raft. And he makes a raft out of oars and jackets. And at this point, Pi is starting to move as quick as possible because he's starting to hear Richard Parker move around. And he knows he needs this raft ASAP, or he's going to die. And while he's stringing his oars and his life jackets together to make this little makeshift raft, Richard Parker pops up from underneath the tarp. So you get a really vivid description of what Richard Parker looks like, and Pi says that he's about to die because he is sitting on the lifeboat with this raft, and Richard Parker's staring at him, and Richard Parker seems to kind of go toward him and put his paw on the tarp, but he's a little unsure because the tarp is like squishy, and he looks a little seasick, a little green around the gills, and he hesitates. And then during that moment, a rat scuttles across the lifeboat tarp, and Pi grabs it and tosses the rat at Richard Parker. And Richard Parker grabs it and eats it out of the air, and Pi jumps onto his raft, ties it to the lifeboat, and pushes away. There are sharks in the water around him, but none of them bump up against him, and it starts to rain. So he has escaped from the clutches of death. It starts to rain, like I said, and so Pi has to go back to the lifeboat, or else he's going to get soaked. He's on this tiny little raft of life jackets and oars, so he's constantly getting wet. So he crawls back onto the boat and doesn't see Richard Parker and feels like he can probably get some supplies from the locker without Richard Parker seeing him. From here on out, I'm just going to call him RP because Richard Parker is really long to say. Okay, so RP is underneath the tarp, and Pi is able to open the locker and grab a blanket, a plastic bag, and the survival manual, but he accidentally slams the lid. Earlier, I was talking about how the locker blocks the way. What I meant was when the lid is open, I think it blocks the way, so he's able to reach in and not worry about RP trying to bite his arm off. I think that's how it works. I don't know. Anyway, he's able to grab some supplies, but RP hears him accidentally slam the lid, and he snarls at him. He falls back off the boat and goes to the raft, and his blanket is soaked, but he spends the rest of the night that way on the raft, cuddling his blanket to him, his feet in a plastic bag, survival manual on his chest. He also grabbed a rain catcher and used that to drink water, so he was drinking water all night, which is great. While he's on the lifeboat, Pi thinks about what to do. He tries to think of different things he can do with Richard Parker. He decides, one, I could try to kill him, but that's ridiculous. Two, I could try to outlast him. He just goes through all these options in his head of what to do. And he lands on option 6 of his, which is wait for Richard Parker to die. And all night he's just thinking, I gotta wait for him to die. That's just all I gotta do. I won't feed him. I won't give him water. He'll die. It'll be fine. And in the morning when he wakes up, soaked to the bone, he realizes he's an idiot, okay? Because tigers can swim. So if he starves Richard Parker, all Richard Parker is going to do is swim to him and eat him. So plan 7 is what he lands on. Keep Richard Parker alive. This is nice because he has this whole scene where he talks about how he's actually grateful because otherwise he'd be all by himself on a lifeboat in the middle of the ocean. So he wants Richard Parker to stay alive, and he's happy that he made that choice. Now, though, he has to learn how to tame Richard Parker, at least a little bit, to allow him to be on the boat, or else in a bad storm, he's just going to die because Richard Parker will eat him. So he remembers how to train animals. You have to show him. He has to put him in the circus ring, show him that he is the alpha, and to listen to him and to associate a bad experience with a certain sound so that the tiger has a little bit of fear. So Richard Parker actually pops his head up for a moment and does this thing called a Proustin, which is like a cute sound, and it's friendly. So Pi is actually really confused because he's like, whoa, are you making a friendly sound at me? But during this moment, he takes the whistle to his mouth and blows until Richard Parker kind of goes back into his den. And that's a success because it means that Richard Parker didn't attack him and instead heard his, call and decided to flee for the minute. So he's trying to stake his claim a little bit at being a other predator to be listened to type of vibe. It's this whole funny scene, too, where he does a bunch of circus talk, and he's like, welcome to the show, and our tiger, and he has this whole little intro that's really cute. Pi reads from the survival guide to try and get a feel for what to do. It mentions that turtles are really good for eating, and their blood is yummy, which is really sad. But anyway, he realizes that his raft acts as kind of a sea anchor for the boat. From what I get of that, I don't know boats, but what I am understanding is that with his little raft attached to the boat, it sort of goes in the right direction instead of waves hitting it from the side and rolling the lifeboat. So it acts as kind of an anchor for a direction. I think that's what it means. Anyway, I don't know. When he's not on the raft, it rolls the boat. So that's important because it makes a seasick cat, which is not great. So Pi is able to go back onto the lifeboat to try and get more supplies. He drinks some of the water that's on the bottom of the boat, which sounds so gross, you guys, because it just, no. If the animals have died, Richard Parker's been sleeping down there. It's just, ugh. He also grabs some solar stills. He adds a mast and a canopy with blankets and some sort of more oars on his raft. He sees that night some glowing green trails from fish and as phosphorus. I forget what they're called, but the little plankton, that glows, the bioluminescence, that's what it is. And he just talks about his suffering. Like, he just suffers on this boat. He's just so sad. He also tries his hand at fishing. He doesn't catch a turtle, and it doesn't really work out that well because he doesn't have any bait. But he goes back onto the lifeboat, and all of a sudden, this school of flying fish just fly over the boat because they're running from these other fish called dorados. And he's able to catch a couple. Richard Parker catches a bunch, and he takes them to his raft. And this is a really sad moment because up until now, Pi's been a vegetarian, but he knows that can't last. He knows he needs to kill this flying fish that he caught. He caught 3 or 4. And he can't behead the fish. He has a little hatchet from the locker, but he can't do it. So he chokes it to death, which is really sad. And he uses the fish head to catch another fish called a dorado. It's big. It's a big fish. And as he's killing it, this time he's able to kill it faster. And he says just because humans can get used to anything, the fish gets all colorful and rainbow colors. And apparently dorados are known for their rainbow, colorful signs when they're dying, which is pretty intense. He gives the dorado to Richard Parker because he needs it. And in general, he checks the new solar stills that he has. He kind of doesn't believe that they'll work, but he looks inside and they're full of water. So he gives himself a bunch of water and he gives some to Richard Parker. What are solar stills, Jade? What are you talking about? Basically, you put sea salt in them, and from sort of solar system, it dries up the salt and the evaporated water goes down and stores fresh water. I don't know. I'm not a scientist, but I think that's what it is. And anyway, he gives Richard Parker some water. Now, he does mix Richard Parker's water with some seawater because he mentions that he knows tigers have the ability to drink saline water and in general be fine. He also mentions that it's almost been a week now since the boat went down. Now, here's something I did not think about until I was reading this, but writing the story of a person lost at sea is not actually that interesting because, well, it is because he wrote a book about it, but it's not interesting daily because there's a lot of repetition and I'm sure just a lot of monotony because you're just lost at sea, right? So every day doesn't bring a new experience, and that's probably part of the worst of it. So how this part 2 works is usually it's Pi telling us about his first experience doing something, the strange things that have happened to him, things he remembers that stand out to him. So I'm going to tell it to you that way. Just assume he's lost at sea. And of course, in between all of this, there's the ongoing battle between his hope for life, despair, sadness. I mean, he is really, really suffering mentally and physically and emotionally. So just keep that in mind, but I'm going to start moving faster. On the heels of that revelation I just told you, the reason why I thought of that was because Pi mentions to us that his time lost at sea was 227 days. Which is insane. He talks about his daily schedule of having a small snack, how he fishes most of the day. He talks about how the salt in the sea really hurt his skin after a while. He'd have boils on him and how his clothes wasted away. He talks about how eventually he learned that he followed the Pacific Equatorial Counter Current, which I looked up and I could barely tell what it was, but that's the current he followed. And he also mentioned that the most useful thing he used were these gaffs, which sound like weird curved spears that you stick into the water and then kind of pull up fish with. And he said that the net and the raft became full of life because he dragged the net behind the raft and algae and seaweed and all these things stuck to it. So fish followed them around, crabs would walk through, and he would just grab the crabs and eat them whole. He didn't cook the fish, he just ate it raw. He loved turtles, he would catch them a lot. And he would even eat the barnacles off of the lifeboat that RP is in. He slept very little, and Richard Parker slept a lot. He used all of his flares, and they smelled like cumin every time. He used them because he would think he would see a ship in the the foreground or the background and shoot one off, and it never worked. But he used almost all of them, and he loved turtles, learned how to carve them, and he decided it was time to really train Richard Parker so that he could be on the lifeboat more frequently and carve out his own territory. How does he do this, you ask? Well, he uses a turtle shell and stands on the lifeboat to claim his territory on top of the tarp, and he whistles really loudly. And anytime Richard Parker tries to step on the territory, he whistles louder, and he rocks the boat and makes him RP feel seasick, so that he associates the whistle with being seasick. He says he doesn't do it very often, and he very long, until just the tiger feels bad. And then eventually, hopefully, RP will come to the point where he will see that tarp as Pie's territory that he's not allowed to step on and associate that whistle with something bad, being seasick. So Pie mentions that the first time he tried it, Richard Parker attacked him and shoved him off the boat, hit him with one paw, shoved him off the boat. Turtle shell was so heavy it almost drowned him, but he was able to take it off, and he did that 3 more times. And he lost a bunch of turtle shells. And then on the 5th time, it worked. Richard Parker listened to him and did not attack him, and he started being able to spend more time on the boat. He says he started cleaning up after Richard Parker, and he has this whole weird episode where, in front of Richard Parker, he fondles, his poop so that it's a territorial thing. It's really odd, but Pie says it was emotional bullying and that it worked really well because it says that he has the right to do this. He is the alpha, person, whatever. But anyway, he says that both of them got really constipated because that's just how it worked. They were always hungry. All of their bodies just started to waste away. He said it just seems really bleak. He mentions that there are sharks always, all the time, and that once he caught a mako shark, just saw it going by in the water, grabbed its tail, and threw it to Richard Parker. And they had a fight. Richard Parker hit it, but the shark bit his paw. And eventually Richard Parker got the best of it and ate it. And he went for small sharks after that. Pie tells us about how one time he caught a Dorado, and Richard Parker saw that he caught this Dorado, and they had a stare down where Pie was like, I want to eat this. This is not for you. And Richard Parker turned away and let him eat it, which was a big deal. Pie mentions that this was possible because RP was a zoo animal. So he's used to people giving him food, giving him water, and used to people servicing him and how they are. I don't know if it would have turned out differently with a wild tiger, probably. But he mentions that usually all of his food went to Richard Parker. He had to eat really fast because if he didn't, then Richard Parker would probably attack him. So he ate his portion fast and gave the rest to Richard Parker. He says his most treasured possessions were bags of water that he stored in the locker, just really big bags of water that he was obsessed with and thought they would break and was terrified of. And he mentions one night there was a big storm, just a huge storm, and he was getting all thrown about. He actually went underneath the tarp for the first time because he figured he's going to die on top. He has to go under. And he hung on to the tarp, stayed on the seat as far away from RP's territory as possible, and they just stayed under the tarp the whole time. And in the morning, he realized that his raft was basically gone, just destroyed. And he's bailing water out of the lifeboat, and he comes across the last whistle, which is so important because remember, the whistle is what is training Richard Parker. He talks about the animals they come across. They came across whales, dolphins, different birds, and he tried to eat them, try to get a bird. They didn't have a lot of meat and stuff like that. He talks about how one time there was a lightning storm that almost struck the boat, and RP was obviously upset by this, but Pie said it was the only time he was genuinely happy because he felt like he could feel God near him. He finally felt so close to God in that moment, and it just meant a lot to him. And he mentions that moments of wonder are easy to come across when you're low, because when you are feeling despair, you think on a higher level, and when you're feeling happy, you think on a lower level. It's a really interesting claim. One day, a ship nearly hits them. There's this big oil tanker that goes by, and he tries to wave at them, and he shoots off his flare, but it goes the wrong way. And the ship, while going toward them, almost hits them, and he and Richard Parker have to really dive out of the way in terms of their boat, and he's able to rearrange them so they don't get destroyed. And at this moment, he tells Richard Parker he loves him. He says, I love you, Richard Parker. I swear I won't let us die. And it's very, very sweet. But then, of course, it goes from that moment to a really bleak moment. He talks about this thing called a dream rag, where he would just get this little rag wet and put it over his face, and like the gentle asphyxiation would give him really vivid dreams because he was so bored all the time. One day they came across some trash and it smelled and it was awful, and he bottled a message and threw it in the ocean. He talked about how his last journal entry was just him wasting away, and it was his last one because the pens were gone. And it's a really bleak journal entry. I don't have the time to tell it to you at the moment, but it's so sad. He's basically like, I'm dying. This is the day I die. And it's really bummer. And then after that moment, one day he wakes up and he realizes that Richard Parker can't really see him, and he thinks Richard Parker must have gone blind. And then Pi goes blind too. The world gets really dark for Pi, literally, and he mentions that that was probably one of his worst days when he went blind, because his body was wasting away. Like, he is covered in boils, remember, and his feet are swollen, and he has no clothes because they all dried up in the sun, and now he can't see. He's on a boat, and he and the tiger are both blind. He can't fish because he's blind, and he says that it was during this moment, during those days, that he heard a voice, and he thought it was a dream. He talks of food with the voice. They talk about what they'd want to eat. And he mentions, I want all these vegetarian things. And the voice is like, oh, I want meat. And after a while, he thinks it's Richard Parker talking to him. And he's like, oh, like, have you killed anyone, Richard Parker? And the man's like, yeah, I killed a man and a woman. And they both realize that the voices are real. So, like, both voices almost simultaneously realize that they're both talking to, like, a person. I don't think either of the voices realized that they did. It turns out that on this weird thing, he has come across another person in a lifeboat lost at sea, and they're both blind. And they talk about what they can share. They're like, oh, do you have food? And they're like, no. Do you have food? And they're like, oh, dang. And they're like, what about like anything to trade, a boot? And they're like, no, I don't have a boot. And eventually they're like, oh, come closer. Let's hang out. And so they bring their boats together, and they're both blind, just a reminder. And they bring their boats together and they tie each other off. And then this man attacks Pi. So Pi is actually really cute in this moment. He's like, sir, I have something to tell you. And the sir is like, you're going to taste so good. Because I guess this guy has just killed other people before. And he's like, but brother, there's something that you're missing. And he's like, I'm going to get you. And then, of course, Richard Parker eats him, which is great. And he cries, Pi cries, because he's so sad. And he searches his lifeboat, finds some food and water, and eats it, and pushes his boat away, the strangers. And cries all night. And the crying kind of like cleans up his eyes. I'm not sure what this was, some sort of hygiene thing. I don't know. But he uses seawater, the tears, they help his eyes. And after a couple days, he can see again. And he kind of wishes he wouldn't, because the man is dead in the boat and it's really dark. And he even like eats some strips of his flesh, which is really, really sad and really like, oh no. One day, Pi mentions that he sees some trees just off in the distance. He thinks he's dreaming. He's like, those are definitely not real trees because they're not attached to soil. They're just like floating. They're just floating trees. And he's like, what are these trees doing here? And he just waits until the boat floats up to it. And even when the trees are right in front of him, he's just like, I'm having such a good time in this dream. Why would I move and show that these trees are fake? And eventually he steps onto the ground and realizes that this is real. This is a real place. It's not soil, but it is a floating island of like algae and trees. And he gets down on the algae and starts eating it. He tears it apart. And basically it's algae. On the outside, it's salty. On the inside, there's fresh water and it tastes sweet and sugary. And he like just gorges himself on this algae. He drinks a ton of the fresh water from inside the algae. He drags himself to a tree. Richard Parker also jumps off the boat and goes exploring. And that night they both come back to the boat. So now begins a couple of weeks on the island. Every day they would get off the boat, gorge themselves on algae, walk around, start to feel a little bit better. Of course, the tiger didn't gorge himself on algae because he's a meat eater, but every day he started to look better too. Scary a little bit. So Pi decides that he's going to have to get back to training soon, especially when he almost like comes upon Richard Parker in the forest once, and he only barely decides not to attack him. And then in another time when he's sitting on the boat and Richard Parker just rushes him like he's going to kill him, and Pi grabs his whistle in time and Richard Parker stops, but he decides he's going to have to start training him again. He uses hoops and begins to teach Richard Parker to like jump through the hoops and follow the hoops, and it works pretty well. And during this time too, he starts to explore the island more because now he can walk unlike before. And he realizes that there are pools of fresh water in the middle of the island, and fish will just like float up these pools dead because he thinks that the algae island has some sort of waterways and the fish get trapped, and slowly as the algae gets rid of the salt in the water, the fish die because they are saltwater fish wandering into a freshwater ecosystem, and they float to the top of these pools. And he also mentions that there are meerkats all over the island who eat these fish, and supposedly, and we see later, it's what Richard Parker is eating because he comes across him and sees Richard Parker just gorging himself on meerkats. And he sees these freshwater pool and he immediately jumps in because he's like, I can't believe I get to bathe in fresh water. And it's really sad. He says that like the salt on his skin is just such a feeling that he can't get rid of. And the fresh water is such a moment of like happiness for him. And Richard Parker and him both spend a lot of time on the island, but they both come back to the boat every night, or Richard Parker does. Eventually, Pi decides, why would I go back to the boat? I'm just going to start staying on the island. And he sleeps in some trees with the meerkats. And he says every night the meerkats go up the trees and stay with him, and that at night dead fish will still rise to the center of the pond, but none of the meerkats will eat it. And then in the morning, the fish is gone. Very suspicious. He says that one day while he's exploring the island, he comes across this tree. And unlike any other tree on the island, it has fruit on its branches. Only half, on like the side of it, it has this fruit. So he climbs up this tree to look at it. And he grabs his fruit and he realizes this is not fruit. It is actually like a bunch of leaves folded around something. So he unfolds all the leaves and inside he finds a human tooth. He takes each little fruit down and unwraps it, and he's able to create 32 teeth, a whole human mouth. And he comes to the conclusion that the island is carnivorous. At night, the island gets acidic. So if he touches on the island with his feet or hands, it gets acidic. The algae gets acidic, and that's why the fish are dying. That's why the meerkats won't go down there. This poor man died in this tree. It's why Richard Parker won't stay, and he realizes that he has to leave the island. So they push off from the island in a newly cleaned lifeboat and try and make their way out at sea again. Nicely, in my opinion, we fast forward through all the more seafaring stuff, and we fast forward to them landing on a beach in Mexico. He is so happy to be on the beach. He almost collapses to the ground because, again, they're weak and famished and just utterly wrecked from this sea life. And he collapses to the ground, and before he's able to do anything, Richard Parker sails over his head and runs toward the jungle. He stands outside the jungle for just a second and then disappears inside it. And Pi is so overcome with sadness that he didn't get to say goodbye. Like, there wasn't enough closure for him with Richard Parker. He just left. And he says that, like his name, humans like to conclude things. His name is so annoying because it never ends. He talks about how he wonders if you can tell his story in exactly 100 chapters, which you can. That's how long the book is. And while he's on the beach crying, people take him in, bathe him, feed him, and take him to the hospital. Now we are on to part 3, which is all from the perspective of the writer. It doesn't feel that way, and I'll explain why. So the writer begins by telling us that Mr. Okamoto and Mr. Chiba go down from California to Mexico because they work for the company of the ship that Pi was on with his family, and they want to know what happened to the ship because they never found it, and they want to know how it happened because it's their company, so they're going to go talk to the lone survivor. And it talks about how the writer reached out to Mr. Okamoto because he wanted to know what they talked about, and he got the transcripts of a recording, and then he transcripted it for us so that we could read it. And at the very end, in the last page, we get Mr. Okamoto's personal note to the company, and that's just the end of the book. But I'll tell you what happens during this bit. Basically, Mr. Okamoto and Mr. Chiba go to speak to Pi about what happened. Pi tells them the story. It's really cute. It just says the story. And they say, that's a terrible story. Like, that doesn't make any sense. We need a better one. We need the truth. And he said, well, it is the truth. Like, that's what happened. And they're like, well, for example, bananas don't float. And Pi said, yeah, they do. Here, test it with these bananas of mine. And they flip the bananas and they're like, oh, look at that, they do. And they give the bananas back and Pie's like, oh, thank you. And in this whole episode, by the way, in the background, Pie keeps asking them for food, like cookies and their whole lunches and stuff like that. And it's really funny because obviously he just got out of being a shipwreck survivor and hasn't eaten food, so he is like hoarding it. It's really funny. But anyway, they say your story's just not believable and we can't tell that to the higher ups. And Pie said, so do you want a different story? And they're like, yes. And so he tells them a different story. He says that on the lifeboat it was a cook, an injured sailor, and his mother. He said that the cook ate the sailor's leg and used it for bait because they ate all the biscuits. He says after a while, the cook killed his mom and fought Pie and tossed Pie her like beheaded head, which is really upsetting. Pie says that he kills the cook and ate him. And he says, what about that story? And they're like, oh, dang, that's really dark. And they comment about how similar his story is to the animal story. And he asks them, which story do you prefer? And they say, the animals. And he says, and so it goes with God. And he tells them basically at the end of this conversation, he has no idea why the ship sank. And the crew was probably drunk and it was probably their fault. And he doesn't know how to help you. Like, that's just not anything he can tell you. And it's really funny. They're like so upset about it. But he decides to go to Canada and he gives them back some of their cookies, which is really cute. They end on a good note. And the last chapter is a note from Mr. Okamoto himself. It says, as an aside, story of sole survivor Mr. Piscine Molitor Patel, Indian citizen, is an astounding story of courage and endurance in the face of extraordinarily difficult and tragic circumstances. In the experience of this investigator, his story is unparalleled in the history of shipwrecks. Very few castaways can claim to have survived so long at sea as Mr. Patel, and none in the company of an adult Bengal tiger. And that's it. That's the end of the book. So some discussion, right? Are you excited? Let's start with some of the technical things first, and then I'll get into like the main ideas and themes and things like that. But something about this book I appreciated was the structure. I did not expect it at all, just in terms of it flipping around between this writer point of view and the part 1, part 2, part 3 thing. I did not know it was going to be like that. I can tell you definitively that the first part annoyed me and was completely necessary. Yes, I was impatient and I wanted to get to the point where there was a tiger and it was exciting and I wanted to get there, but it was completely necessary to even make sense of the story and to even make the story seem slightly believable. Like, in order for a reader to suspend their disbelief, you have to give them that background. It's just that the background went on for a long time. And a lot of it is the key to the story, especially the religion. So a lot of it's completely 100% necessary. It's just that, in my opinion, you should change the back cover of this book because the back cover only covers the last half. It covers page 200 on. So I don't know. I thought the back cover did it an injustice and made me feel really impatient. But otherwise, I did actually enjoy the structure. I find myself wondering about the writer. And if you read this book, you might too. Not Mr. Martell, the writer, but the writing perspective that we have. I think it was an interesting choice. I think at times it feels weird. And it's a little confusing, but I feel like I understand why he did it. So if I was writing this book and I wanted to give you an ending that you could choose the ending of, so you get to decide, is he in a boat with a tiger or is he, with a cook and a sailor and his mom? You get to decide the ending. I think that if he had a completely unreliable narrator, if it was Pie himself telling it to us without a lens, then I think we would all be tempted to just believe the tiger anyway. I think this is an attempt to give us some sort of step away from being exactly in Pie's head. And in general, he's telling us the story, but it's actually him telling the writer and the writer's telling us the story. It's like a point removed. So it's not really an unreliable narrator. And because of that, I think it allows the reader to have a little bit more of an unbiased opinion. But in my personal opinion, I feel like that almost doesn't work. I feel like since part 2, the part about the tiger, has absolutely no writer in it, that it just feels like Pi is telling it to you, and I prefer to feel that Pi is just telling it to me. So in a way, I think that attempt to be a bit removed from the situation and to imply that you're looking at it from an unbiased view is almost kind of tricky of him, because the whole point of the book that I'm going to talk about in a second is, do you believe in the unbelievable, or do you believe in reason and what is, less crazy? And I feel like he almost sets you up to obviously say you want to believe in the tiger story, because yeah, it is the better story. But I think that if you were gonna, like I said, if you're gonna try and pass it off as not being an unreliable narrator, then you can't also be an unreliable narrator, because while we can assume that this might have been written by the writer talking to Pi, it's not. Pi is talking to us, the reader, and especially for part 2, which is the part that it's about. So I don't know. I almost feel like it's almost a little tricky of him to say, oh, it's not an unreliable narrator, and then to have it still work that way, because it implies to us that we should believe him because it's not him telling us the story. It's a second person. So I don't know. It's one of those things where I see what he was trying to do. In a way, it worked because I think that we all look at it and we doubt the story. But in a way, it doesn't work because none of us doubt the story. None of us think that that's the real story, because we just spent 50 plus pages talking about his everyday life with Richard Parker. And if it wasn't true, then it doesn't make any sense. He wouldn't have all this detailed information about him. So the paragraph at the end that could be the real story really doesn't make any sense to me, because of course that's not the real story, in my opinion. It might make more sense, but we just read 200 pages of a story versus a paragraph. It's going to be the long one and the one that we spent with Pi. So in my opinion, the writer, it's whatever you want to feel about the writer. I think that it's useful, but I think that almost it wasn't necessary. And I feel like he was good at leading us where he wanted us to go without us realizing it. And I think that that's one of the key things that this writer is the best at, is leading us where we don't realize we're going, but it perfectly makes sense. So we don't realize that he's leading us into a believable tale about a tiger being on a boat. And we don't realize that he's leading us to believe in the tiger story until we get there. So he is very good at putting the story in terms of what he wants us to see. Lastly, let's talk a little bit about the themes of this book. I honestly think that the themes of this book are really easy to catch on to because he talks about them. He talks about religion, faith, God, despair, low and high thinking. He talks about life and death and hope and fear and all these things he talks about. And what I really think this story is about, like we've said multiple times, it's about faith. Do you believe in the better story, or do you believe in one that might make more sense, but it's not the better story? Sometimes believing in the unbelievable is difficult, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. And I think that that's the story of Pi. That is the life of Pi. Because I don't know if you noticed that the title of this is not Pi in a boat with a tiger. It's Life of Pi. So it's Pi's entire life. And it makes sense that the tiger only takes up part of it, because his life is not about the tiger. His life is about his choice to believe in God and believe in faith and believe in religion and believe in the things around him that are the better story, that are somewhat more unbelievable, because it adds to his happiness and it benefits him. And this argument is made by showing us multiple times that that is a scientific way of thinking. So it's like the combination of science and faith. It tells us that as animals, we all have a little bit of madness inside us, and we all want to live in ways that benefit us, even if it's not to our nature. So if that is inviting a tiger onto the boat because despite the fact you might die, it gives you a friend, even if it's deciding to believe in God despite the fact that maybe science says that it's not stand to reason. It's just stuff like that. That's the theme of the book. It's what do you believe in, and this is why you might believe in that. And I think that this book is also a lot about dualities. So again, we have hope and despair and life and death. Life is dualities. It's opposites. It's ups and downs and surviving against all hope. And I don't know, I think that this book, its themes kind of sit on the surface. It is what it is. It tells you. And those important chapters in the middle really just talk about the story and your decision between something unbelievable or something that makes more sense, and that you should choose the one that's the better story, even if it's a little bit mad. My favorite thing about this is actually not that overall meaning. My favorite thing is probably that little bit of madness. I think that that is something that maybe people won't see, but I really liked it. He mentions it just once about how animals have this little bit of madness that allows them to do certain things. And I think that he doesn't even talk about it in terms of people, but that it's really present in Pi, the entire book. It's present in almost every choice he makes to keep Richard Parker alive in his life. Like, it's just, we all have a little bit inside of us that allows us to make choices against our nature in order to benefit us in some way. And I think that that is really key to the story. And I think that that's a really nice thing to take away, is like, that's a little bit mad, yeah, but that doesn't mean that it's not helpful. So it's an interesting thought. That's all. And lastly, just in case you didn't notice it, maybe you did, but this is a loss of innocence story. Again, do you guys feel for it now? But this is not Catcher in the Rye. It's a little bit different. It has a lot of despair in it, but it is different from Catcher in the Rye, because Catcher in the Rye was just about loss of innocence. This is about a lot of other things, but this is also about Pi's loss of innocence. He goes from having a family and feeling like adventure is great and being excited for Canada and being unsure in his life about certain things to being on a tiger with a boat, and he loses his whole family and has to learn to survive himself through bleak events in his life and all these terrible events that occur to him. And eventually he comes out of it feeling desolate. But at the beginning, like we're told, he finds solace in both religion and zoology. It's the duality of man and the duality of our choices, and he finds that he can move on and be happy, and while he might still be haunted by it, it's not as depressing as Catcher in the Rye, I think, but it's still a loss of innocence story. We're watching Pi's loss of innocence, and you really feel that throughout the book. You really feel him just losing certain parts of himself that I don't think he ever thought he would lose, like his vegetarianism, the fact that he eats a guy, the fact that he plays with Richard Parker's poop, stuff like that. Like he does really wacky things just because he has to. And so it's a rough book, but it's a good story. I talked about earlier how in the book discussion, it asks you whether you think this is a tragedy or a comedy. And in my personal opinion, I think it's a tragedy because it's a loss of innocence story. Even if it ends happy, I think his happiness is always tainted by this event. And you can tell from the beginning that that's how it is. But I think that his true happiness is in his faith. And I think that this book really is a study of faith, duality, and madness. Those are my 3 for this one. Anyway, I had a really good time reading it with you. Thank you for following along with me. This episode went a little over time, but I still had the best time talking to you about it. This was such an interesting book. I had never read it before. I saw the movie a really long time ago, but didn't really remember it. And so it was really fun to read, and it was not what I expected. And I think that if you are on vacation, maybe give it a try. Like I said, it is kind of sad, but it's also really well done. And there are lots of heartwarming moments, where he finds the island, and lots of moments that are really nice to read that won't keep you down for too long. I think you should not read it if you are on a cruise. Or maybe you should. I don't know. This would be a good survivor's manual. Maybe look at it. But anyway, thank you so much for listening, lovelies. If you want more Bad Book Club, you can follow us on all of our social media at Bad Book Club Pod. You can support the podcast and buy one of the books that I talk about, and at the same time also support a local bookstore, which is really nice. And lastly, before I go fully, I just want to tell you to keep your eyes out because I may have a surprise or two coming your way this week. So keep your eyes out. But I hope you had the best time listening with me, and I had the best time talking with you. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a great week. We'll see you next week for our episode on The Secret Garden, so that will be fun. please subscribe and review. It helps the podcast so much. It helps me get out there. We hit 500 downloads last week, which is just so fun for me. I'm so excited. But please keep reviewing and subscribing and telling people about the podcast because it's really helping. So I love you guys so much and have a good week, and I'll see you next time. Okay, goodbye, goodbye, goodbye.